Imagine you're standing in a really drafty room, and there's this window. For months, maybe even years, that window has been, like, completely painted shut.
Right.
It's just stuck.
Exactly. You've tried prying it open, you've tried pleading with it, but it will not budge. Then, one random Tuesday, seemingly out of nowhere, you hear a click. The sash moves.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The window slides open just a tiny crack, and you feel this incredibly fragile breeze of fresh air. Common sense tells you that you need to grab something like a book, a shoe, whatever, and prop that window open immediately.
Because if you don't...
The breeze is going to catch it, it's going to slam shut, and honestly, who knows when it will ever open back up again?
You know, that window is essentially a child's willingness to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
It's a totally fleeting, highly unstable condition. And if you don't act the literal second it happens, the opportunity it vanishes.
Which brings us to the mission for today's deep dive. We are exploring a radically different approach to K-12 mental health care. Specifically, we're looking at a systemic model operating right now in Georgia called MentalSpace School.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating setup.
Right. They are using a same-day tele-therapy structure. So our goal today is to examine the massive administrative and, well, clinical bottlenecks in student mental health care, the things keeping that window painted shut, and break down how the specific framework is trying to dismantle them.
Because the reality for most parents out there is just an absolute nightmare.
It really is. I mean, think about it. You finally get your child to that elusive moment of courage. They say they want help. You pick up the phone, and the voice on the other end tells you the next available appointment is in 6 weeks.
6 weeks. It is a sentence no parent should ever have to hear.
No, never.
But to really understand why a model like MentalSpace even exists, we have to kind of deeply analyze the anatomy of that delay. We have to look at what actually happens to a human being during a 6-week wait list.
I do want to push back on the framing of this for just a second, though.
Sure.
Because it's very easy to look at this through the lens of, like, modern impatience, you know? We live in an era where we expect our groceries delivered in 2 hours, packages arrive by tomorrow morning.
Yeah, the Amazon Prime effect.
Exactly. So is this outrage over a 6-week wait just a symptom of our instant gratification culture, or is something fundamentally more dangerous happening when we make a child wait 42 days for therapy?
I can tell you it is definitively not about modern impatience. Not at all.
Okay, so what is it then?
The outrage is rooted in the actual clinical trajectory of a psychological crisis. When a student finally looks at an adult and says, "I'm struggling, I need someone to talk to," their nervous system is heavily taxed.
It's exhausting.
Completely. They have taken an enormous interpersonal risk to vocalize that need. Vulnerability requires a tremendous amount of energy. So if the systemic response to that massive risk is a bureaucratic holding pattern,
Just a please hold, your call is important to us.
right, the student's brain interprets that delay as a flat-out rejection.
Oh, man. So they learn that asking for help doesn't actually yield relief. It just gets them a calendar invite for next month.
And way more anxiety today. And here's the thing. Mental health issues in adolescence are not static.
They're constantly moving.
Right. A child doesn't just sit in a frozen state of suspended animation for 6 weeks.
Yeah.
By the time that appointment finally rolls around, the crisis you were trying to intercept has usually mutated.
It got worse.
Exactly. The window where intervention would have been manageable, where, say, cognitive behavioral adjustments would have been way easier to implement, that window is completely gone.
It's slammed shut.
Yes. A delayed response takes a preventable situation and essentially guarantees that it ferments into a full-blown emergency. It's a systemic failure of timing.
And, you know, looking at the sources, that paralysis extends to the parents, too. The data shows that parents often debate reaching out for weeks before they even make the initial phone call.
Oh, absolutely. They second-guess themselves.
Right. They're trying to figure out, like, is this just a phase? Can we handle this internally, or do we really need to bring in a professional? So by the time they're dialing a clinic, they are already just exhausted.
They're running on empty.
Exactly. And if that exhausted parent is turned away and told to wait a month and a half, a significant portion of them just give up. They literally never return to the system.
Which means time is the absolute enemy of intervention here. The traditional model operates on this flawed assumption that mental health care can be scheduled like a routine dental cleaning.
Yeah, let's pencil you in for next Thursday.
Right. But a mental health crisis is much closer to a physical injury.
I mean, if a kid breaks their arm on the playground, you don't tell them to put some ice on it and wait until mid-November to see a
Yeah,
specialist.
you go to the emergency room immediately.
Go to the ER.
Hmm.
And I think that brings us to the real structural pivot of the mental space model we're analyzing. Because their direct response to this agonizing delay is same-day teletherapy.
Right? Same day.
If a Georgia family reaches out, the system is designed to respond that very day, not after a 3-week intake process, today. But I have to ask about the mechanics of this.
Here, what's the concern?
Well, same-day teletherapy sounds a whole lot like the, Uberification of healthcare.
Ah, yeah. The gig economy
Yeah,
approach.
exactly. If you're guaranteeing speed, aren't you just throwing whatever random available gig worker therapist is online at the kid? Like, how do you maintain any sort of continuity or quality control in a rush like that?
It's a really valid question, and honestly, that is the exact trap a lot of commercial telehealth platforms fall into.
Where you just log on and get whoever.
Right? You log on, you get whoever's on shift in, like another time zone, and you literally never see them again.
That sounds terrible for a kid who needs trust.
It is. But the mechanism that prevents that here in the MentalSpace model is the implementation of dedicated therapist teams assigned to specific schools.
Okay, dedicated teams.
Yes. This isn't a massive randomized call center. The school administration and the designated therapy team form a direct, ongoing partnership.
So it's essentially embedding a virtual clinic right into the physical building.
Functionally, yes.
No.
Because think about it, a randomized therapist in a different state doesn't know the culture of a specific Georgia high school.
Right, they don't know the local context.
Exactly. They don't know if the community just went through a localized tragedy or what the specific regional stressors are. A dedicated team creates continuity.
So they actually become part of the community.
They do. The therapists become familiar components of the school's broader ecosystem. It bridges that gap between the rapid deployment of digital health and the deep trust of community-based care.
I am so glad you brought up the word ecosystem because structurally embedding these teams into the schools broadens the scope of what the therapy is actually trying to accomplish.
It has to.
Right. You can't fix a student's mental health in a vacuum. You can't just treat the child for 45 minutes and then, drop them back into a chaotic environment and expect them to somehow thrive.
No, because the environment surrounding the child is often the primary driver of their internal state.
Exactly. And the model we're examining reflects this. They deploy a surprisingly comprehensive suite of K-12 support. It goes way beyond just individual student therapy.
What else are they including?
Well, according to the source text, they include crisis intervention, suicide prevention, and violence prevention.
Which, unfortunately, is basically a bare minimum requirement in today's educational climate.
Sad, but true. But here's the interesting part. The program also integrates staff wellness and family counseling, and that staff wellness component is, frankly, fascinating to me.
It is unique.
Right. Like, why allocate resources to the adults in a program that is fundamentally engineered for K-12 students? Shouldn't every single available dollar and minute be pointed directly at the kids who are in crisis?
It seems counterintuitive at first, but you have to look at the mechanics of school-level trauma.
Okay, unpack that for us.
A healthy school ecosystem absolutely requires robust support for the adults who are managing it. Teachers, counselors, administrators, they are functionally acting as first responders in these buildings right now.
Wow. Yeah, I guess they really are.
They're absorbing a massive amount of secondary trauma. When a teacher spends all day trying to manage a classroom where multiple students are dealing with severe anxiety, depression, behavioral outbursts, that teacher burns out.
And a burned out teacher probably misses the signals.
Exactly. They miss the signals, they lose their patience, and their capacity to recognize and gently prop open that moment of courage for a struggling child is severely diminished.
So by establishing a mechanism for staff wellness, you're basically reinforcing the safety net beneath the students.
You're ensuring the adults actually have the emotional bandwidth to support the kids.
You're oxygenating the whole room, not just handing a mask to a single patient. I love that. And there's another critical layer to this ecosystem approach regarding the therapists themselves.
Oh, the cultural competence aspect.
Yes. The framework specifically requires that these dedicated teams are not just licensed, but diverse and culturally competent.
Which is another vital mechanism for ensuring that moment of courage doesn't go to waste, because speed alone isn't enough.
Right. Explain how a lack of cultural competence undermines the care, even if you do manage to get it on the exact same day.
Well, let's just play out the scenario. A student finally speaks up. The system works perfectly, right? They're sitting in front of a screen with a therapist that same afternoon.
Sounds great so far.
Right. But what if the professional on the other side of the screen lacks the cultural framework to understand the nuances of that student's family dynamic or their socioeconomic background?
Or their lived experience in a specific minority community.
Exactly. The student is going to spend the entire session just trying to explain their reality rather than actually treating their trauma.
They'll feel like a tour guide to their own life.
Yes, they'll immediately feel misunderstood. Cultural competence and diversity among the therapist teams ensure that when the door is finally opened, the student actually feels seen by someone who speaks their emotional language.
Okay, so all of this the same day response, the dedicated, culturally competent teams, the holistic ecosystem approach. I mean, it sounds incredible on a clinical level,
It really does.
but, and this is a big but, a comprehensive system like this is utterly useless if a family cannot afford it.
Right. Cost is a massive barrier.
Or if a school district cannot legally figure out how to implement it. Red tape is the great filter of public health initiatives, right? So we have to pivot here from the clinical dream to the administrative reality.
Absolutely. Because you can have the most elegant clinical model ever designed, but if the bureaucracy is impenetrable, the care never actually reaches the patient.
Right. The friction has to be removed at the structural level. So let's look at how this model addresses the two biggest roadblocks,
Right.
money and the law. First, the financial friction for the families.
Yeah, when a parent is debating for weeks whether to make that phone call, cost is usually the anchor holding them down.
They want to help their kid, but they are terrified of getting hit with a massive out-of-pocket medical bill.
It's a very real fear.
It is, and MentalSpace systematically removes this hesitation by operating with a $0 copay for Medicaid.
A $0 copay, that's huge.
Yeah, while simultaneously casting this massive net across major commercial insurance providers. We're talking BCBS, Cigna, Aetna, UHC, Humana, Peach State, CareSource, Amerigroup. They take practically everything.
And the mechanism there is crucial. By integrating heavily with both state-funded Medicaid and all those private commercial networks, you're bypassing the financial filter that usually segregates the quality of care.
Right, the parent doesn't have to sit there at the kitchen table with a calculator to figure out if they can afford the copay this week.
They just make the call. The barrier is gone.
But getting the parents on board financially is only half the battle. The legal friction for the school district is arguably way more complex.
Oh, it's a minefield.
Right. If a school's legal team thinks introducing external medical data into an educational environment is going to violate federal law, the program is dead on arrival.
They won't even touch it.
Exactly. Now, the framework we're looking at guarantees dual compliance with both HIPAA and FERPA. Can you break down why that collision of laws is such an absolute nightmare for schools to navigate on their own?
Oh, it is a massive legal headache. So schools are governed by FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act.
Right.
This federal law dictates who can see a student's educational records, things like attendance, grades, disciplinary history, and it gives parents the right to access those files.
Okay, so FERPA protects the student as a learner.
Yes, but the moment you introduce a clinical therapist into the building, even virtually, you are suddenly dealing with protected health information.
Oh, right. Diagnoses, therapy notes.
Exactly, psychiatric evaluations.
Yeah.
That information is governed by HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, and HIPAA has incredibly strict, fundamentally different rules about privacy, consent, and who has access to the data.
So you have a student who is sitting in a school building, generating FERPA data just by being there.
Right.
But then they log onto a laptop in the counselor's office to talk to a therapist, which generates iPay data. Where is the line?
That is exactly the paralyzing question administrators face. If a principal asks the therapist, hey, how is the student doing? Are they a danger to themselves?
Yeah.
Does answering that question violate iPay?
Wow.
Does keeping the therapy notes on the school's server violate FERPA? If a school tries to build their own internal therapy clinic from scratch, the legal liability of navigating that intersection is astronomical.
They would have to hire, like, a fleet of lawyers just to figure out if they're legally allowed to send an email about a kid having a panic attack.
Precisely. So a teletherapy model built specifically for the educational environment, one that engineers dual compliance right out of the box, removes an enormous administrative burden.
The school doesn't have to suddenly become a healthcare compliance expert.
No, they just utilize the secure framework provided by the service.
And there is a ticking clock regarding administrative compliance in Georgia right now that forces the issue.
Yes, the deadline.
Right. The deep dive into this model highlights a legislative deadline surrounding House Bill 268, which hits in July 2026. For anyone outside of school administration, or really anyone just paying taxes and wondering why schools are scrambling to overhaul their systems, you really have to understand what this bill mandates.
HB 268 fundamentally shifts the responsibility of mental health and safety protocols. It mandates that schools must have concrete operational frameworks in place to manage student well-being and crisis response.
It's essentially the state government telling schools, look, you can no longer just wing it when a kid is in crisis.
Right, the days of winging it are over.
You have to have a documented functional system. The problem is schools are educational institutions. They are not hospitals.
They're really not.
They don't have the internal infrastructure to suddenly become comprehensive mental health facilities by July 2026.
Which is exactly why a model like MentalSpace positions itself as an administrative shield just as much as a clinical service.
Ah, an administrative shield. I like that.
It offers the structural support required to hit that legislative mandate. The district doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. They don't have to scramble to build a clinic from scratch. They just integrate a pre-built compliant system.
It's a pragmatic alignment of incentives. You merge clinical best practices, getting the kid help on the exact same day with the totally bureaucratic necessity of hitting a state mandate.
Right.
When you solve a superintendent's legal and administrative headache, you drastically increase the likelihood that they'll actually adopt the service.
And ultimately that means thousands more students get access to the care they need.
Exactly. So we've mapped out the theory, the legal maneuvering, the clinical structure, but the ultimate metric of success for any paradigm shift is the outcome. Does this combination actually work in the real world?
That's the most important question.
Right. And the outcome data presented in this model is striking. They show an 85% family satisfaction rate.
Which is very high, indicating the parents actually feel supported.
Yeah, but the two clinical metrics are what really demand the most attention here. A 92% reduction in anxiety and an 89% improvement in attendance.
Those are massive numbers.
They are. And I really want to dissect that last number. Why is attendance the standout metric for a mental health therapy program? Usually you would expect an educational intervention to boast about improved test scores or decreased behavioral referrals.
Right, standard school metrics.
Yeah, why focus on getting the kid in the building?
Well, the connection between the 92% reduction in anxiety and the 89% improvement in attendance reveals the physical mechanism of untreated trauma.
Okay.
You have to consider what anxiety actually does to a student on a Tuesday morning. When a child is trapped in a mental health crisis, and the traditional system has told them they have to wait 6 weeks for help, the sheer dread of waking up is overwhelming. Getting out of bed, getting on a loud bus, walking into a crowded, overstimulating hallway, and trying to process algebra while their nervous system is in full fight or flight mode. It's often an insurmountable task.
So anxiety doesn't just make them nervous, it literally physically manifests as avoidance.
Yes, chronic absenteeism, or school avoidance, is frequently a direct symptom of untreated mental health struggles. The child's brain is telling them the environment is unsafe, so they simply refuse to go.
Wow. But when you completely bypass that terrifying 6-week wait,
Yes.
and you treat the anxiety on the exact same day the student works up the courage to ask for help, you intercept that avoidance behavior before it hardens into a permanent habit.
Exactly. The student feels a sudden reduction in internal pressure. They feel capable of showing up to class because the crisis is being actively managed.
That makes so much sense.
So that 89% improved attendance isn't just an administrative victory for the school's funding formulas. It is the physical proof that the student's anxiety has been deregulated enough for them to actually participate in their own life.
It proves that mental health isn't some isolated extracurricular part of a student's day. It is the absolute foundation of whether they can even walk through the front doors of the building.
It really is.
And for parents listening to this who are currently trapped in this exact nightmare, the ones who finally got their kid to open up, only to be hit with a massive wait list, this model offers a direct pipeline. The initiative specifically calls out to those families, directing them to MentalSpaceSchool.com or allowing them to email MentalSpaceSchool at checksatherapy.com directly.
Yeah, it's very accessible.
And they end their public outreach with an incredibly reassuring promise. They just say, "We've got you."
It is the systemic antithesis of the next available appointment is in 6 weeks.
Truly. All right, let's recap the journey of today's deep dive. We started by examining that incredibly fragile moment of courage, that tiny breeze of a child's willingness that is so easily lost when they are forced onto a traditional bureaucratic waitlist.
Right.
We explored how a systemic model like MentalSpace completely flips the script by offering same-day teletherapy, utilizing dedicated, culturally competent teams embedded directly within the Georgia school ecosystem to ensure real continuity.
And not just for the kids, but for the staff and families, too.
Exactly. We dissected how removing financial friction through Medicaid and commercial insurance, alongside solving the complex legal collision of FERPA and HIPAA, paves the way for schools to actually meet looming legislative mandates like HB 268.
Without having to become legal experts themselves.
Right. And finally, we saw how all of this restructuring actually results in tangible outcomes, like a massive 89% improvement in a student's physical ability to just show up to school.
You know, it really forces us to look at what happens when a system is engineered around the urgency of the human experience, rather than the slow convenience of the bureaucracy.
Absolutely.
And it leaves us with a pretty profound question to consider as we look beyond just the educational system.
What's that?
If a structural shift to same-day care can yield an 89% improvement in something as complex as school attendance simply by catching a human being in their exact moment of courage,
Yeah.
what other critical crises in our society, from addiction recovery to housing instability, are we fundamentally failing to solve simply because our rigid systems force people to wait 6 weeks?
Man, it really makes you wonder how many other windows we're letting slam shut every single day. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking questions, and we'll catch you next time.